Welcome, everybody. We'll get started in just about one more minute. All right. Well, let's get started. Thank you so much for joining us for our workshop today with the Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. I am Kim Klett, Deputy Executive Director for the Educators Institute for Human Rights, where we cultivate partnerships among educators globally to create materials and deliver training based on best practices in Holocaust and human rights education. Together, we deliver content and strategies for teaching conflict history and prevention and sustainable peace. Currently, we have projects in Rwanda, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Cambodia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Argentina. I would also like to thank our community partners at the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center. Before we begin, I would like to present a land acknowledgement. The area where I live in Gilbert, Arizona, is the land of Tohono O'odham tribe, who are now often referred to as the Papago. It is important to acknowledge that this is their land. Their first recorded existence is 1535 in New Spain, and they continue to thrive today in Arizona. As we live on their land, it is important to seek ways to help them. In the O'odham's history, they are scientists of the environment, and that is a good place to start. Next, I would like to acknowledge the land where our office sits in Washington, D.C., which is the Anacostan and Piscataway land. These two groups live in the district, occupying land near the U.S. Capitol building and the entire area of the current mall. The Anacostans no longer exist as a tribe, but many are believed to have merged with the Piscataway, some of whom may be descendants of the Anacostans. The Piscataway live today mostly in Washington, D.C. and areas of Maryland. Now we will begin the workshop with Christine Dindissi McCleave, the Chief Executive Officer of the Native American Boarding Schools Healing Coalition, to learn about the history of the boarding schools and explore ways we can introduce this in our classrooms. Please feel free to ask questions in the chat box, but we will hold those until the end. And thank you so much for being with us today, Christine.
Thank you for having me, Kim. Good day, everyone, whether it's morning or evening where you're at. I was going to say good morning, but I realized some of you may be tuning in the evening, so good day. Dina way magini duk, Dindissi and Dijinakas, Makinakwaju and Dunjiba, Magizi and Dudame. What I just said to you in my native language was greetings, my relatives. My name is Dindissi, which means blue jay, and I am from Turtle Mountain Reservation. I am Ojibwe and I am Eagle Clan. My English name is Christine McCleave, so I go by Christine Dindissi McCleave. And I'm the CEO for the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. Our mission is to lead in the pursuit of understanding and addressing the ongoing trauma that is a result of the U.S. Indian boarding school policy. And for those of you who don't know anything about this history, we always start with the historical context of starting with manifest destiny and the doctrine of discovery. There was a papal bull that the Pope issued that said any lands that people find that are not being inhabited by Christian people can be claimed for the church and the crown. And so this gave this idea to people who were, exploring and finding these lands that they could claim them. And so the doctrine of discovery is actually still cited in some US Supreme Court cases in the current modern day era as, legitimate claims to the land that was already being occupied by indigenous people here on Turtle Island, which is also known as North America. This painting is from 1872 by John Gast, and it's called American Progress. And that was this idea of manifest destiny, that this was God's will. And this angel named Columbia is moving from east to west, and she's, bringing progress with her. And you can see in the forefront, there's agriculture. In the background, there's a port town. There's the railroad being laid down, the stagecoach and all of that. And then in off to the west, where it even gets darker, and the indigenous people and the buffalo are being chased away. That was the idea that this country was founded on, and all of the federal Indian policies that this country instituted were aimed at one thing, and that was land acquisition. So I appreciate Kim's land acknowledgement at the beginning of this call, because it's so important not only to acknowledge that these lands are being occupied by people who have not been here for more than a few generations, but also to just bring awareness to that history, right? To change that narrative and have people think differently about this country than what we've been taught or told. So when we talk about the historical trauma that happened in the boarding schools, which I'm going to get to that in a minute, it's important to set the context, right? So the context is that there were many layers of historical trauma, starting with contact and exposure to diseases that people didn't have immunity to. And then, as settlers started to colonize here, they displaced the indigenous peoples and had conflict, and invasion and removal is another layer. Straight up Indian wars, when the government went to war with many tribes, to assimilative policies aimed at either eliminating our sovereign status, which if you're sovereign, how can someone else make you unsovereign, right? But the US has attempted that, and relocation and boarding schools, assimilative boarding schools. Currently, we're in the self-determination era, because that started in the 70s after the civil rights era, and the American Indian movement, a lot of legislation came into existence that was really set towards tribes being self-determining and upholding sovereignty, and specifically emphasizing the nation-to-nation relationship between two sovereigns, a tribal nation and the United States government. And but this is a timeline here of US Indian policy. You can see, so this is from our publication called Healing Voices. So I actually wrote this timeline, and so it doesn't include every single federal Indian policy, but it includes the important ones that we wanted to highlight. And you can note that it says over here in 1492, pre-1492, Turtle Island was inhabited since time immemorial. And then in 1492, Columbus gets lost and is discovered by indigenous people in the Caribbean. And I wrote it that way because it needs to be a counter narrative to this whole Columbus discovered. No, Columbus was lost, right? So, and Columbus, we know from his journals that he was a bad man. He was interested in using the indigenous people, young girls, for human trafficking, sex trafficking. And so we shouldn't be honoring Columbus. That's all I'm going to say about that. So you can see from these other policies, that there were things called the U.S. Dead Indian Act, Indian Removal Act, but specifically this Indian Civilization Fund Act of 1819 is one of the two policies that make way for Indian boarding schools to occur. The treaties were signed between the tribal nation and the government, and in those treaties, the tribe said, okay, we're going to cede our land to you. We're going to give you the land. And in exchange for giving you the land that we occupy, we are going to get from you, where the government said, we'll give you rations, because you're not going to be able to hunt here anymore, hunt and gather. We'll help feed you and your people, and we're going to give you education and medical. We're going to give you healthcare. We're going to take care of your people, and other things that were included in those treaties. And so the government had to set up the Indian Civilization Fund to administer those services and resources that they promised in exchange for all the land. So there's a lot of misconception even today, because people just don't understand. They're not educated. They think Indian people get welfare. Yes, we get things from the government, but it's payment for the land. It's not welfare. It's not free. We gave the land for those payments. So that's really important. And the treaties didn't give us any special rights. The treaties retained our rights. We had those rights to begin with, and we retained them through the treaties. So there's so many nuances like that, and I get like passionate about it, right? Like I'm like, hey, you, even though I can't see you, and it probably wasn't you who was saying things like that, but there's so many people who just don't understand and have been told and taught this other perspective, right? So I'm here to share the Indigenous perspective and hopefully enlighten you all on that. So these funds were being used by the government, and they created, the Civilization Act, and because the funds were really meant to civilize us, right? To civilize us, to indoctrinate us into Western culture. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is the main department that deals with all of that, all of those services for Indian country today, was created in 1824 under the Department of War, because the Department of War was the part of the government that was used to dealing with Indian nations. They were still trying to remove tribes from some of the lands. And so Bureau of Indian Affairs was originally under the Department of War. So when you take an agency that is primarily thinking like, this is the enemy, these people are in our way, we need to remove them, we're at war with them, we're killing them, they're killing us, and now I'm supposed to give them food and medical and education. Well, it's no wonder that it wasn't going very well, and that there were a lot of corrupt Indian agents in the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And so in 1868, President Grant put into effect the peace policy, which did two things. One, he said, we are now in a time of peace, and we are no longer making peace treaties with Indian nations. So he put an end to treaty making, even though there were still Indian wars going on. And so it was not a peacetime. And the other thing is, his peace policy allowed for the funds from the Indian Civilization Fund to be used by Christian missionaries, because of the corruption and animosity with the Bureau of Indian Affairs being under the Department of War. So that made way for federally funded church-run Indian boarding schools. So no separation of church and state there. They were definitely in this together. And so overview of boarding schools in this country is that the first federal off-reservation Indian boarding school opened in 1879. That was in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And these assimilative boarding schools ran through the 1970s until we got into the self-determination era, where you see here Indian self-determination and education assistance, American Indian Religious Freedom Act, Indian Child Welfare Act. All of these, those policies changed the way Indian boarding schools were able to affect Indian people. So a religious freedom, because when we were in these schools, it was assimilation. The children were taken from their homes. They were put in uniforms. all of their culture and language was prohibited. And so by 1978, when we get the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, that is in direct opposition to what these schools were doing, which was to prohibit our religious freedom. And also the Indian Child Welfare Act was, aimed at combating the fact that our children had been taken and continue to be taken to this day. So there's still some issues, even despite the Indian Child Welfare Act. And we found 367 boarding schools in the U.S. That were open for 100 years. Some of these boarding schools are still open today, but they are no longer what we call the historic assimilative model. So the schools that are open today now encourage language and culture rather than prohibit it. So it's a different type of Indian boarding school, but some of them have that legacy, right? They used to be that type of boarding school that basically carried out cultural genocide. A lot of trauma happened to children at these schools, but over the generations, over that 100-year period, some students went to these schools and ended up having a positive experience. I've talked to boarding school survivors who said they loved their boarding school, they met their spouse there, or they made lifelong friends. And so we acknowledge that and we honor that. Not everyone was abused at these schools, but a lot of people were. A lot of people, even if they weren't abused, talk about how lonely these schools were, being separated from family and being raised by an institution, and also the disconnection from land, community, language, and culture. So General Pratt was the guy who had the idea for Carlisle, the first federal off-reservation Indian boarding school. And so a lot of the pictures, the historical pictures that you might see, came from Carlisle, like these ones. He actually created this propaganda, hired a photographer to do these before and after pictures. And we call this the Sea of Children. So a lot of these pictures from Carlisle were because he was trying to prove that his experiment was working, this, transformation. You can see they changed the lighting and the students even look whiter in the after pictures. So he thought he was doing the right thing. He wrote a book called The Red Man's Moses. He was a Christian. He thought this was the right thing because he's quoted here saying, "A great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one. And that high sanction of his destruction has been an enormous factor in promoting Indian massacres. In a sense, I agree with the sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man." So because that's what was going on in the day. They were actually killing Indians. The only good Indian is a dead one was the motto of the day. And he changed it to kill the Indian and save the man. So he thought he was doing a compassionate thing, but what it really was cultural genocide. And he probably had no idea that's, 150 years ago, thinking was different, We didn't have the Geneva Convention at that time, but according to the United Nations Geneva Convention, the definition of genocide includes any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, such as killing members of the group, causing serious bodily harm or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. And the United States has done all of these things. All 5 of those have happened here in the US. And there has never been any kind of reckoning. There has never been an acknowledgement from the United States of its treatment of Indigenous peoples. There has never been a truth commission or any kind of process to hold the U.S. accountable, to make reparations to Indigenous people for the harms and the human rights violations that we have endured. And most people don't think about what happened here as genocide. It's not discussed and it's not framed in that way, except I do have 2 examples of books that talk about it in those terms. One is by David Stannard, The American Holocaust, and the other is Benjamin Madley, An American Genocide. I mean, he focuses specifically on California, but a lot of what happened in California happened around the US. And so when people say cultural genocide, it is genocide. And it's ongoing, because what happened with the boarding schools was they had these summer outing programs, and children, students would be sent in the summer. Instead of sent home, they were sent to work on people's farms or work in their homes as domestic servants. And the school was paid money for their labor. And then they did give some of the money in some cases to the children, but not all of it. So they would give them a portion of their wages and keep the rest. And what they found was, when the students went into these towns and communities, they integrated and assimilated more quickly. Some of them, maybe met somebody, decided to get married and moved to that town. Or at the very least, maybe their English improved if they hadn't spoke very good English before. So they realized that they were assimilating faster if they were placed directly in a home with white people. And so they created, the Bureau of Indian Affairs created the Indian Adoption Project, right? It was cheaper to just place the children in a home, to adopt them out to a white family, than to run these expensive government boarding schools, okay? Or church run, but federally funded. So the government was thinking dollars here, what was cost effective, right? Let someone else raise the child and bear the financial burdens, right? So they would place ads in the paper like this one that say, and this one doesn't, but another example of an ad we have in our publication says, "The children come in all hues and colors." And so it was really a commodification of our children. And there is money to be made off of adoptions. Actually, the average adoption in this country to this day costs $60,000. So somebody's making money off of these children. And when the Indian Child Welfare Act went into effect, it was to combat our children being removed. So targeted by social workers who would place the child in foster care, and then eventually the child would be adopted out. This is still happening today, despite ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act. Our Native children, depending on the state, there's different statistics, but always, we are placed at higher rates per capita than any other ethnic group. And those placements still lead to adoption. So like, for example, in Alaska, the number of Indian children in the child welfare and foster care system is like 50%, although Alaskan Natives are only 25% of the population. And I don't have stats for other states, but it's always like we are, there's more of our children in the child welfare system than we are of the population. It's always higher. And so that's still a problem going on. My history is that my grandfather went to boarding school. So he's pictured on the left here, Buddy Willett. He went to Marty Catholic Indian School and also Haskell Indian School. And then my great-grandfather went to Carlisle Indian School. So that first Indian boarding school, he was there from 1910 to 1915. And he was on the football team, and he played football with Jim Thorpe, the famous Indian athlete. And he went there as an adult. As you can see, he's a grown man here. He was 20 when he arrived, but he left there with a third grade education. So these schools really did not focus a lot on education. The children were actually used as labor. So they might spend half their day doing education, but the other half was learning a trade or how to, domestic skills. It was really about assimilation and training them to be laborers and farmers. So this family history led me to do my master's thesis on spiritual leadership in modern day Native culture, with the intersection of Native spirituality and Christianity. I wanted to look at the areas of conflict between traditional Native spirituality and Christianity, and the areas of compatibility. And so I did some interviews of leaders, and their congregations and found that there was a spectrum of spiritual practices going on. There were, on one end of the spectrum, Native American people who were wholeheartedly Christian and didn't practice their, traditional Native spirituality, didn't want anything to do with it actually because it wasn't aligned with Christianity. And on the other end of the spectrum, there were people who had returned to their traditional Native ways and that didn't want anything to do with Christianity because of the history there. However, these two opposite extreme ends of the spectrum were not representative of everyone. In fact, most people were in the middle, kind of like a bell curve, and they were blending the two theologies and practices to varying degrees. So, for example, I went to a congregation and they sung hymns in their native language, and they did a smudging before the service, but then they also read the gospel. So they had elements of both. So it seemed like those people who were blending and able to tolerate the other religious perspective were more likely to be understanding about people who didn't share the same religious views. They were also more likely to be active in their community. For example, the church would host language classes or be doing outreach in the community. The biggest area so there was a lot of compatibility, right? Like if they were blending the two theologies and practices, they found that they were very similar ideologically, but there was area of conflict, which is why you end up with the two extremes and the people who say, I don't want anything to do with the other, right? The biggest area of conflict that I found was around the role of spirits, angels, demons, and ancestors in spiritual practices. And ultimately, my conclusions that I came to for my thesis were that the history of the church and Native Americans cannot be overlooked. In fact, it must be addressed for the well-being and spiritual health of Native people. Church leaders who continue to teach that Native American culture is non-biblical or evil are perpetuating the cultural genocide and human rights violations of Indian boarding schools and other Christians who have criminalized Native religion. Taking an active role in reconciliation and reparations as a spiritual leader can help heal generational trauma caused by boarding schools and other historical traumas, and can produce healthy Natives inside and outside of the church. And then I made some recommendations. Well, this one was a quote from a speaker at Natus. It says, for Native peoples to follow Jesus, they can best do so not by becoming Christian, but by following their traditional ways. Any religion that is based on exclusivist notion of salvation necessarily becomes a religion tied to conquest and empire. And then my recommendation was the church and its leaders should not ignore their role in the history of assimilating Native Americans in North America and the cultural and spiritual devastation that these actions brought. So when we talk about intergenerational trauma, we quote Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart. She coined the term historical trauma and defines it as the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding over one's lifetime and from generation to generation, following the loss of lives, land, and vital aspects of culture. We also know from science that epigenetics, which epi means on top of. So there is a genetic marker that can be passed down through your DNA that originally Dr. Rachel Yehuda did a study on the children of Holocaust survivors and found that they carried the same PTSD marker in their DNA that their parents had, even though the children had not directly experienced the Holocaust, that it was passed down, and that they were more likely to suffer from depression and anxiety and things like that. And what's interesting about this is that Native people knew this, but we didn't have any, scientific data. We didn't do research to prove it, but Dr. Rachel Yehuda did, and we're grateful because we're like, yep, good. We knew this was happening, and now there's proof, right? So epigenetics are real. She repeated her study with Iraqi war veterans, veterans from the Iraqi war. And she also did a third one with mothers who were present and pregnant at the 9/11 attacks. And so their children were in utero experiencing that trauma in utero. And they also were born with the epigenetic marker. So another study that we look to understand the trauma that was caused by boarding schools is the ACEs study, and that is the Adverse Childhood Experiences study that was done by Gallup. And essentially, if you have 4 or more of the 10 adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, then you are likely to have adverse health outcomes as an adult. And what we know is that trauma interrupts a child's developing brain. It sets a chemical reaction that wires the brain to work differently around stress and trauma. If you had more than 4 ACEs as an adult, then you're more likely to have anxiety or depression. You're more likely to be chemically dependent or addicted. You're more likely to suffer from diabetes and heart disease and obesity, and just more likely to die an early death. Well, this is a death sentence, an early death sentence that me and other people refuse to accept, because we know that there you can do healing and that you can change some of these things that were set into motion with these childhood traumas. But it can also be passed down intergenerationally through behaviors. If a child experiences ACEs like at a boarding school and then grows up to have some of these issues as an adult because they haven't dealt with the trauma, then they are more likely to provide an environment that possibly creates and produces more ACEs and childhood trauma for their children. So that it becomes this cycle. But if we carry intergenerational trauma, and we do, then we also carry intergenerational wisdom. It's in our genes and our DNA. I love this quote from Kazu Haga because it's true. We as Indigenous people are so resilient. We're some of the most resilient people on the planet. They tried to genocide us and we're still here. And Dr. Braveheart talks about the process of transcending historical trauma in just 4 easy steps. Ready? Here we go. Number 1, confront the historical trauma. Number 2, understand it. Number 3, release the pain. And number 4, you can transcend the trauma, right? Like easy peasy. No, it's not, because step number 1, confronting the trauma, the historical trauma, we're not there, folks. The United States has not confronted this history. And so we can't understand it. And we can't move past it until we confront it. We have to acknowledge it. Canada had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And, here in the United States, okay, so I'm just going to tell you this. Here in the United States, only 6 states directly mention Indian boarding schools in their K-12 educational content standards: Arizona, Washington, Kansas, Oklahoma, South Dakota, North Dakota. Okay, so we have a problem here. Adams wrote in his book, Education for Extinction, that, 20,000 children were in boarding schools in 1900, and by 1925, 60,000 were in boarding schools. But those are estimates. He doesn't actually know, because no one knows. Like I said, Canada had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was the result of a class action lawsuit for Indian boarding schools in that country. And it was a 5-year commission. It ran from 2010 to 2015. And they found that Canada had 150 boarding schools, and that 100,000 children went to those boarding schools. And 3,000 of them died or went missing. Here in the United States in 2016, the coalition did a FOIA request, and FOIA stands for Freedom of Information Act. We asked the BIA how many boarding schools there had been in the US, how many children went to those boarding schools, and what happened to those children. And they responded that they couldn't answer because they don't do research, meaning the records are spread out all over the place and they don't know. No one has ever looked into it to see. So we worked with some researchers, and over a number of years did the research and found, the 367 boarding schools that we found to date. We did that. Government couldn't provide those answers, but we don't know how many children went to those schools, and we don't know how many died or went missing. And we've been looking for the records of those boarding schools. In May of 2019, based on some of the research that we did, and some researchers who were doing this work on their own, who shared their information with us, and in partnership with a few other organizations and tribes, we went to the United Nations and we filed a submission to the Working Group on Enforced Involuntary Disappearances and said, we have found the names of children who went missing at these boarding schools. So they were taken into federal custody, sent to these schools, and then they died or went missing, and they are missing to this day. So we actually brought some people to Geneva to testify that their relatives, a couple generations ago or whatever, had gone to these boarding schools and were still missing, and they didn't know where they were at. And the US did not respond. And of course, we think that has everything to do with the administration at the time. Now that there's a new administration, we have looped back to see if we can get a response, because under the United Nations Human Rights Council, when there are these human rights violations, the victims have a right to the truth. Okay, so we have a right to know what happened in these boarding schools. So this is our boarding school list. It is on our website, boardingschoolhealing.org. There's a lot of resources for you there if you want to keep learning about this. We're turning this list into a digital map so that you can see where the boarding schools were, and that you can you can click on a profile and see like a little bit more information about a particular school. But that again is, proving to be a lot of work and research that we're having to do ourselves that should be done by a commission. Okay, I'm just going to say that. So where are the records? Well, we haven't found all of them. That's part of why we need a commission to, the government needs to be held accountable and say, here are the records for the schools that we either funded or ran, right? So a lot of the federal run schools, those records are in the federal archives, but that's only 38% of the schools. The rest are going to either be in church archives, historical societies, universities, museums, and other private collections. So we're still looking for all of the records from all of the boarding schools. And we're creating a digital archive. So we're collecting, preserving, and making accessible a digital copy of these records of Indian boarding schools. Because right now, if you had a relative that went to a boarding school, you would have to travel, and for example, if it was a school in Alaska, you might have to travel down to Seattle, but the record might also be all the way in Denver, right? So the records are spread out and not really accessible to the descendants of these students or the relatives who might want to know what their relatives' experience was like. Also, if we put the records together from different schools, then we'll have a better picture of what boarding schools and their impacts look like across the country. And so that's some of the work we're doing on that. We also, when we find the record and digitize them, we want to work with the tribal communities because we want to uphold tribal data sovereignty, indigenous data sovereignty. And what that is the right of indigenous peoples and nations to govern the collection, ownership, and application of their own data. Okay, so this is kind of a new concept. It shouldn't be, but yeah, after a couple centuries of academic colonization, as I have coined the term, academic colonization is the perpetuation of paternalistic settler colonial mindset, taking over indigenous spaces and narratives through academic research that absence indigenous voices, perspectives, and worldview, and in extreme cases seeks to profit off of indigenous history by non-indigenous people, right? So this has been happening for a long time. White academics come in, study an indigenous people, and then they're the expert on this indigenous culture or practice or whatever, right? No, it should be the indigenous people who are the experts and who determine how data about their culture is collected and used, right? So we work with tribal communities to uphold their data sovereignty, and consult with them before we digitize and make public any of these records. So we have a whole methodology around that. We've also been doing an annual conference that, of course, got put on hold and turned into a virtual event last year. We're going to make it virtual again this year and hope to put on our in-person conference in the spring of 2021. But our virtual summit is coming up in November. Here are the dates. You can sign up for news on our website if you want to learn more. Also, during the pandemic, we created We Love You elder care packages because our Indian boarding school survivors are, getting older, and they were, most at risk from COVID. And we wanted to send them not only some PPE, some hand sanitizer and masks, but also some treats, some coffee, some chocolate, something to brighten their day. As we were hearing from a lot of our elders and survivors that they were feeling very isolated, and it was actually triggering memories from boarding school when they were, being cut off from community, friends, and family. And so we called them We Love You care packages because we also know that a lot of times our elders did not hear We Love You from their parents, especially if their parents went to boarding school. But if they were raised by an institution, that there's just that lack of loving, caring, and nurturing. They didn't receive it. And so they may have had a hard time showing affection to their children because they didn't know how. So there's this thing about we didn't get hugs from our parents, or we didn't hear We Love You. So we wanted to tell them that we love you. And we sent out, the goal was to do 1,000 packages, and we've done close to 900. So we're still sending packages. And then recently we launched the boarding school healing scholarship and fellowship program. This is in the scholarship is in partnership with the American Indian College Fund, and it is for Indian youth who want to go to college, and they have to submit an essay that talks about if they have a boarding school survivor in their family, a relative, and they have to tell the story and talk about how it has impacted that relative's life and their life. So we're trying to make this connection with the younger generation to say, you should be talking to your relatives, your aunties and uncles and grandmas and grandpas about their boarding school experience and knowing those stories because it impacts your family. And then the fellowship is for graduate students to do research on Indian boarding schools. And again, we want Native people researching this Native history, right? So this is meant to help support Indigenous scholarship. We also have a study going right now with the University of Minnesota on Indian child removal. So it's looking at boarding school experience, adoption, and foster care. And we're going for 1,000 responses, and I think we're at 700 or 800 right now. So we're hoping to close the survey soon and start doing our data analysis. What we found from anecdotal evidence was that basically if someone experienced boarding school, that they were more likely to give their children up or have their children taken into foster care or adopted out. And so there is this connection between, the assimilative boarding school and having this, the being told that your children are better off being raised by someone else, and then having that happen throughout generations. So we're also looking at the impacts of those different forms of child removal, as well as the healing. We have a whole section asking people, how they've healed or what they've done to heal. And so because our vision for the organization is Indigenous cultural sovereignty and restoring what was taken through the boarding schools, we believe that includes the right to set the terms of healing and reconciliation. So, we uphold tribal data sovereignty, and we think, Indigenous scholars should be the one doing the research and things like that. So we worked with former Congresswoman Deborah Haaland, now Secretary of the Department of the Interior. Before the pandemic hit in February of 2020, I was able to visit with her and tell her about our work and say, the US should have a truth commission. if and when they do one, we've got a lot of information that the commission will want to look at, and we can share that. And by the way, until we get a commission, we're just doing the work of a commission ourselves. And it's kind of hard. So, hey, we'd really like some federal, we'd like some federal acknowledgement and accountability here. So she introduced a bill in September for a Truth and Healing Commission on Indian boarding schools. And the timing was interesting because the president at the time was talking about signing an executive order encouraging schools to give students a patriotic education, one that doesn't teach lies about the country being plagued with racism. I can't even read it with a straight face. Like, I just can't, right? Like, so this was her clap back to be like, oh yeah, and we need a Truth and Healing Commission on Indian boarding schools if you want to talk about racism, right? So the bill did not go through. There was a lot of political theater going on, the election and everything. So it didn't go, but she is now, at the Department of the Interior and still supports this. And so we're working with Senator Warren's office to reintroduce the bill again this session. And so where does that leave us? Well, I could talk a little bit more about the term reconciliation. We don't like it. We don't think it's the right term. That's why the bill got introduced as a Truth and Healing Commission, not a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I won't go into all of the stuff about reconciliation, but I will point out this cartoon that I love from, and this is in reference to the South African Truth and Reconciliation. So we've got Desmond Tutu, and he's leading the people, and he's got his little map, and, they've uncovered the truth, but there's a gap between truth and reconciliation. And he's like, how do we get there? My map doesn't tell me how to get there, because what's missing is justice. Okay. So transitional justice is a framework that we think has some good merit to it in that, and I need a slide for it. I don't have it. Oh wait, I do. Here we go. Okay. Transitional justice consists of judicial and non-judicial measures implemented in order to redress legacies of human rights abuses. It may include criminal prosecutions, truth commissions, reparations programs, and various kinds of institutional reforms. What's missing from that definition is that transitional justice not only acknowledges the human rights violations and makes reparations, which those two are really important before you're going to get to this reconciliation, right? Like, which I think of as like, oh, we're walking off into the sunset together because now everything's good, right? Well, things are not going to be copacetic until you fix what you broke. And and then acknowledge. And here's the thing that transitional justice includes: a promise not to repeat the harm, because in Canada, the hashtag reconciliation is dead started trending last year. Now, they had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the government was still perpetuating human rights violations, Indigenous rights violations, and I can't remember the name of the tribe, but there was a land dispute, right? Like it's sovereign land, it's Indigenous land. And I believe they were trying to run a pipeline through it, So we continue to have to fight for our rights, and our rights are still being violated. So how can there be reconciliation when you haven't enacted justice and you haven't upheld your promise not to repeat the harms? Okay, so that's what's missing. And that's why we can't have reconciliation. We can't just, Biden gave really beautiful speech, after his inauguration about healing. But hey, look, we cannot just spiritually bypass what happened. We cannot gloss over the fact that racism is still happening, right? So I'm in Minneapolis, where, last year, the eyes of the world were on us after the murder of George Floyd and all the protests that were sparked around the country and around the globe. And since then, there have been some movements. The Minnesota Council of Churches plans for a Truth and Reconciliation and Reparations process, and the city of Minneapolis passed a resolution establishing a Truth and Reconciliation work group. And I'm part of that work group, and we're going to be making our recommendations to the city next month to recommend that they have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And we did talk about reconciliation, and we haven't found a better word. We haven't found a better name for it. So we're going with truth and reconciliation, even though it has its misgivings about, we have misgivings about the word reconciliation. So, so here is a quote from Yes Magazine. I was interviewed last fall, and there's a lot of movement also with HR 19 and HR 40 for a reparations for African Americans in the United States. And they said, what do you think about that? And I said, the acknowledgement of the cultural genocide of indigenous peoples is imperative to reparations or movements to improve the lives of Black Americans, because it's not like, oh, we should be in competition. We need a truth commission more, and you need it more. It's, we both need it, right? And I think that this country needs to acknowledge how it treated the people who were here first, and then how it treated the African American slaves that they brought over, right? Like those two groups of people. I mean, then we can talk about the rest of the BIPOC people, right? Like we need to acknowledge those first two groups who have been the most affected, because other racial groups are still being impacted by systematic racism. And if we can't get to the heart of how all of this started in this country, nothing is going to change. So the call to action is, here's how you can get involved. You go to our website, sign up for e-news, join the coalition. It's free to join. Follow us on social media. There's a lot of educational resources on our website. Get involved, support the work in whatever capacity you can. And now we can open it up for questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Christine. That was amazing. I was furiously taking notes as you were talking and learned a lot. One of our questions, and I'm just looking for it here, came from Alex Zapruder, who is on our board for EIHR and is the author of the book Salvaged Pages, Young Writers' Diaries of the Holocaust. And so she wondered if there were any diaries found that were written by an Indian child in any of the boarding schools.
So I have not seen all of the records, so I don't know, but from some of the records that I have seen, it's not like a personal diary, but there are school assignments. So an essay or a poem, we've found drawings, but these are all in the school records, so they're more official than something as personal as a diary.
And another question comes from Alma Jero, who is in Bosnia and is on our staff. She wanted to know how much of Native American history is taught in today's schools in the US. She knows that that's a big question with the different curricula and standards in different states, but maybe you could share your experience with how and if this history was covered in school for you and what you see today as far as changes in that, if any.
So I grew up, I think this is very common, like most people, unfortunately, especially in grade school here in the US, the textbooks don't mention Indigenous people past 1900. It's like, oh, they were here, and then the settlers came and like they disappeared. So I remember being in like third grade, and it was Thanksgiving, and the teacher brought in hominy and talked about like native foods, but then she also gave us that whole narrative about the Pilgrims and the Indians sitting down and having this friendly dinner. And it wasn't until I was like, in college that I learned the actual true history of the Wampanoag, and that, feast that they did share with the settlers and save them from starvation. And then later that group of colonists massacred the Wampanoag. So why isn't that part of, what we're teaching children? And so, no, there is not adequate education about the history from a balanced perspective. It's definitely, the victor has written the story and erased the Indigenous perspective. And I think that's why so many people have misconceptions about Indian people today. and, what we look like and what we do. And, it's complicated. I'm a dual citizen. I'm a citizen of the United States and a citizen of my tribal nation. And, I have certain indigenous rights, and but I also have, a lot of historical trauma, so I see somebody saying that they promised to teach it. We actually have, I forgot, I should have a slide. I keep forgetting. We have a free curriculum, and we've set it into 3 parts where, if you teach grade school or middle school or high school. So there's just four lessons, and it covers, the history, the impacts, some stories, and healing.
Great. I think that a lot of us would find that really helpful. And I was wondering, when you put up that list of the boarding schools by state on the website that you have, I was thinking that would be a really good research assignment for students. Within the layers, because I know you said you're still working on the research, is there enough where students could find some information and learn more about it that way?
Yeah. Oh, there you go. She just put, so yeah. Oh, and I only sent it to the panelists. Yeah. So I just put the link in there. Yeah. The curriculum, you should follow the curriculum. Like, I don't think you need to make up a lesson based on the list. There's good enough information in the curriculum for an exercise like that. I didn't write it, so I can't recall exactly, but I'm like, I think we did similar. We did something, right? So you should take a look at the curriculum. Yeah.
And this question kind of goes along with it. Somebody else asked, as a non-Indigenous grad student, how would you suggest furthering my understanding and learning of the Native American boarding schools, especially those in my area?
Yeah. So, I mean, you can learn about it. I just don't think non-Indigenous people should be the experts, right? So, but it's important that everyone knows this history. So certainly learn about it, be an ally, go onto our website. There's a resource database. There's, we've got lists of books that people have written, some Indigenous scholars who shared their dissertations and their research with us. There's, I can't say it enough, and I'll just keep saying it, just go to our website. Like, we work really hard to provide a lot of free educational resources. So if you really want to learn more, you can spend hours on our website.
Great. And Abby is asking, what legacies of cultural genocide do you still see in schools? While not boarding schools, what institutional legacies are still embedded?
I mean, that's a big question. I think the biggest thing is just that overall Native American people are marginalized beyond, we're the marginalized of the marginalized, right? So, for example, when there are statistics that are broken down by race, sometimes we're not even included because we've heard, that we're statistically insignificant. We're less than 2% of the US population, but we used to be the entire population of this continent, so we're not insignificant. And just imagine how that feels to have somebody say that your group is insignificant, right? And then, that gets into like mascots and, this negative caricatures of our culture. And, you're not freaking honoring us by doing the tomahawk, right? Like, don't lie to yourself and lie to us about that. So I think in schools, if there is an Indian mascot, the school needs to talk about that, right? The schools need to teach the history and include Indigenous students. I think the biggest thing is invisibility. Even just recently, like CNN, had a racial graphic and it said something else instead of Native American. And, this is ongoing. This is like recent. This is modern day history, right? The media is terrible about representing us accurately, going all the way back to, movies about cowboys and Indians. And of course, it's all about the narrative and what story is being told, right? And the story used to be that these merciless Indian savages, because that's what we're called in the Declaration of Independence. These merciless Indian savages, are dangerous. And so these settlers had to protect their families from us, and that's their perspective, that's their narrative, versus these white people came and invaded our lands, and we have to protect ourselves from them because they're killing us to have access to the land, right? So history has only been told from one side and one perspective. And I think that's the most damaging, ongoing, systematic racism present in our schools.
And so following up with that, one of our staff members, Matthew, asked about what we can do if we have one of those mascots to, and if we're working to change that mascot, what advice could you offer for that?
To be in connection with the Indian community that's nearest to you. So I'm going to share my screen again really quick here because I skipped this slide, and I want to talk about it. So, in land acknowledgements are a great thing. That actually came out of the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It was one of the 94 recommendations that they made, the calls to action. And it's so basically in Canada, anytime there is a public gathering, they have to do a land acknowledgement. And what's nice is that people here in the United States picked up on that and are voluntarily doing it. However, it is not just about checking the box. It has to be about actually building relationship with those people. And we have a different type of relationship to the land. So I'm also going to share a resource. The Native Governance Center wrote a really good how-to on land acknowledgements, because it's great to know whose land you're occupying. And what I appreciated about the land acknowledgement at the top of today's call was that, it also said, like, where are those people, and, where are they now, right? And so it has to go beyond that into, I keep just sending it to the panelists. Let me try to send it again to everyone. There we go. Okay. So this link that I just sent you all to a land acknowledgement talks about that, right? So as Indigenous people, sometimes we get called and say, like, I'm trying to write a land acknowledgement, please help me, right? Well, you should be offering to compensate us for our time, right? Like, so Western culture is very transactional and very extractive, and Indigenous culture is very relational. So that's always something to remember. And in terms of, the mascot question, it's the same thing, right? Don't do it to just check the box. Do it to build relationship with the Indigenous people who are affected by that mascot, and do it to help change the narrative amongst the non-native people who see that mascot and, hopefully wouldn't object to changing it, but you never know, people get attached to their mascots. So that's all I have to say about that.
Great, thank you. And you had mentioned that Senator Warren will be reintroducing that act. Would it be helpful for us to write letters or contact our elected officials to support that?
Absolutely, yes. Yeah, so sign up on our website, and once the bill is reintroduced, we'll be notifying people, or follow us on social media, and we'll be posting about it. We can't, because we're a 501c3 nonprofit, we can't tell you to write a letter in support of it, but we can educate you on the issue, the fact that there is a bill, and say, contact your legislator and tell them what you think, right? And hopefully what you think is that the bill should be passed.
Thank you. So I want to go back to a couple of questions we had earlier in the program. What is the difference between the Indian boarding schools and the reservation schools?
Well, I think I might need more specifics on that question. Is the reservation
Or who asked it, whoever asked that, it's just under anonymous. If you want to clarify, maybe in the chat box.
So there were different types of schools, right? So when I say Carlisle, I say off reservation federal boarding school, right? So some of the boarding schools were on the reservation, some were off the reservation, some were run by the federal government, some were run by the churches. There was a lot of different, some of them in California were called mission schools, not boarding schools, right? So they're all the same. When I say boarding school, I'm talking about all of them. If the children lived there, not a day school, right? So there's boarding school and a day school. Boarding school, the children lived there, and day school, they went home in the evening, just like a regular school.
And then another question that came up earlier was, and I don't remember if you answered this or not, did the families have any say in the adoptions?
Sometimes, but not all the time. What's difficult to answer questions, that are like sweeping generalizations, and I get it, but it's hard to make those generalizations. There are stories of women being told to sign a release form thinking it was to be released from the hospital, and they were actually signing over their child. There are other stories where the child is taken through the county social services. The social workers just come and take the children. There's so a lot of times I would say they were taken against the parents' will, but in some cases the parents did choose to give the children up, and again, that may have been a decision that was influenced by being brought up in a boarding school themselves and thinking that they weren't, fit to parent.
Exactly. Thank you. And one other question, and if anybody has any last questions, make sure you put those in the chat box because this is the last one that I saw. For the care packages, the We Love You program, people were saying that they would love to support that. And so I saw there was a link on the slide. Could you please share that again so we could do that either on our own or with our students?
Yeah. Let me find that.
And while you're doing that, Tasha Giles, who's a good friend of mine, just mentioned that she said my grandma unknowingly signed over one of her daughters and never saw her again.
I saw that.
Yeah. And the new adoptive family moved out of the state. Yeah.
Yeah. So my good friend and mentor, Sandy Whitehawk, is an Indian adoptee who returned back to her family and in her adult life and reconnected with her community and her culture. And she works with other people who were adopted out, or parents who adopted their children out. And one of the most difficult things is when it was a closed adoption, meaning the information about who the parent was or who the adoptive parents were it's a closed file. You can't open it, right? And so that's really sad. A lot of times nowadays they recommend open adoption in case the child ever wants to find their birth parent or whatever. But it's very sad when there's no opportunity for those adult children to reconnect if they want to. It can be very, very challenging to deal with that. Like that's a lot of loss and grief without any closure. So
Dana says, thank you for a fantastic presentation and your vital work. And I love this question. What is your dream vision of what reparations could look like?
That's interesting because I definitely have this dream and the vision of getting the commission, but I hadn't thought past that. Like let's just get a commission. I would say definitely, what we want to see is a change in the narrative in this country that would ultimately change how we treat people, not just Indigenous people, but all people, that there would be more racial equity and not so much racial disparity, that, there would be some reparations around access to wealth. All the wealth in this country was built off of stolen land and stolen labor. So let's level the playing field.
Thank you. Any last questions?
I see
Well,
Tasha.
Christine, yeah, Tasha just responded about that. As an adult,
thank you for telling me that, Tasha. I'm glad that she did reconnect. That's important. So important for healing for everyone.
Well, Christine, thank you so much for your time today. This was fantastic. Julia just asked one last question. Do you think there are also legacies of inequities in access to healthcare services?
Absolutely. I don't know if you followed it or saw that when the pandemic was in its early days, that, like last summer, people were like, oh, interesting how like we're noticing racial disparities in, coronavirus, right? Like because of access to healthcare, socioeconomic status. And yeah, there is absolutely. So, if you live in a urban setting as an Indian person, access to healthcare isn't as challenging. But if you're on the reservation, the healthcare is provided by the Indian Health Services through the BIA, and it's government provided healthcare. So that's all I'm going to say about that.
Christine, thank you again for your time today, for this thought-provoking presentation. I'm sure that so many of us will take this back to our classrooms in the fall or even this year, depending on when we're ending our year. If you have questions, again, feel free to reach out to us. We're in contact with Christine and are happy to provide any of those links if you missed them. And again, thank you so much. We'll definitely check out the website and get more information and continue learning about this important topic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.